As a result of the statements after this meeting, there are no even hints of any military supplies to Russia from China. Of course, they could still do dual-purpose technologies trade, and they have been doing that. There are different gray schemes they're using, but as it stands, Russia cannot currently do any strategic offensives in Ukraine. They cannot even do operative level, wider than 150 to maybe 200 kilometers wide, and they can only do some tactical motions, and that scary Russian offensive that everybody was talking about, it's now very limited to small pieces and operative elements on the front. They're dying under Bakhmut, their steam is out, they're making more efforts near Avdiivka, but not successful because they need to throw more people into the grinder there in order to try to achieve something. Up north near Kupiansk, they're also ineffective, and their officers, their commanders, are now facing very uncomfortable alternatives. We're bringing the map, by the way, Alexei. It's okay. I'll still talking about Chinese topic, but it's okay. So Russian commanders now have to drastically reduce their activities on other parts of the front in order to be effective on one of them. But as we understand, when these things happen, that makes our tasks easier, because first of all, we can concentrate our artillery and our troops to grind them more effectively where they are concentrated. A good example is Bakhmut. Also, reducing their numbers on other parts of the front, would mean that the conditions for our counteroffensive are becoming more favorable there. In order to change that, Russia needs to throw another mobilization, another at least 200,000 to the front, which is questionable due to reasons we already mentioned. I think they can announce that, of course, but the problem is to really gather them. And then China, in this case, would need to equip all that group. If Russia is now asking China to sell food rations, we can understand how deep in shit they are. And in this case, in order to change anything on the front, China needs not to just supply something to Russia, but to switch to really dramatic level of supplies and make it continuous. And that will be somewhat of a suicide for China. It is not something that they can change by quiet sales and quiet supplies here and there, and then perhaps cover it by saying that it's North Koreans sending it through us. It's not us. That may, and maybe buy some 2 weeks of time while resisting the pressure from the West until closing it. That will not help. They need to literally increase everything, make it a highway into Russia with military supplies and all the helmets and body armor. If China even supplies that, will not change the situation much. That's why we're seeing on the trains Russia is bringing T-54s, tanks produced in the T-55s produced in the middle of the 20th century. That's pretty impossible, right? How do you even bring that crap to the front? Well, they're switching to a very diet mode. So we've seen the tanks produced in the 50s, we've seen the tanks produced in the 48s already. And we're seeing even some uniform produced back in the middle of the 20th century. So all they literally have is they're running out of anything modern. They have about 60% they're substituting with old and outdated equipment and dress. They are screaming about running out of artillery shells, about their artillery tubes being overused and needing replacement. So even China coming in will not be able to change the situation. If they do any one-time supply or shipment or dripper supply, it will not change anything. It's a dead end. All right, let's run along the front then, in the context of several statements that we heard. For example, right now we are showing the map. Let's start near Bakhmut. Prigozhin came out again and said that near Kramatorsk-Slaviansk, And as far as I understand, Konstantinovka or Dushkovka, I'm not sure which one did he mention. So he's saying that Ukraine group is about 70,000 facing his troops near Bakhmut, and he was drawing on the map. He was very active and vocal, and he is saying that this group possibly can run over Wagner troops, and this will be the main direction of Ukraine offensive. Do you see that eventuality possibly happening? Because if you're looking at the map, Bakhmut is in somewhat semi-encirclement. I'm looking at the map. Do you think that action by Ukrainian troops is possible in that Bakhmut area? Or is it just a maneuver? Well, let's see what our military men are saying officially. Let's look at their official statements. On the level of commanders and operative commanders, they're saying that Russian attacks near Bakhmut are fading away. They're using the formula, which is not exactly a military formula. I need to translate that from Ukrainian into Russian, but it means Russia has lost tactical capability to take Bakhmut. So if to explain that for civilians, it means that people and material supplies that they have do not allow them to solve a question of taking Bakhmut. Just by calculations, mathematics of war does not allow them to do that. Calculations of how much concentration of their troops do they need to have per mile of the front is failing them, and they cannot take it. And for us, it's a task what to do with these pincers that are hanging over Bakhmut. That means they cannot, since the Russians run out of steam, they cannot close that pincer. The attackers are always in a very problematic position, because when they're attacking, they're not preparing for defense. They're not digging trenches, they're not creating material supplies, logistics and depots. They're not fortifying and strengthening their front. And you need to, in order to be successful, you need to dig rather deep trenches, waist deep, at least. So offending troops are always in a very precarious position. They're not ready to defend. They need to either withdraw if something goes wrong, or to win and destroy the enemy and be in a position when nobody threatens them. They took their victors, and everything is good. If what Prigozhin is saying, if that is true, if what our military are commenting on that, then Wagner is in a very uncomfortable position at this moment. They are still attacking, they're still throwing also some Russian paratroopers into that fray. But now they're faced with a question. Keep their taken positions, then they need to drop their machine guns, rifles, and start digging real fast, and yes, starting yesterday. If not, for a time they will continue being very vulnerable. And our command could use this time to attack them on the flanks. This is a long, very vulnerable pincers that we can attack and cut off at any moment if we have enough troops to do that. War is not like a badminton game, but it's not predictable, it's not one than the other, but it's doable, it's possible, and if that counteroffensive happens on this front, it'll be very hurting to Russian troops on that side. And if we don't, it means that we probably see that situation differently and we have other priorities. Because unlike us, you and me and our viewers, command has a lot more data to analyze and work with. Near Avdiivka, they also escalated their action, but according to what Russians are discussing in their social media, they're throwing newly mobilized troops into the fight there. There was a good example of a battalion from Irkutsk where out of over 100 people attacking, they had only 3 people left alive. And that's systemic in that area. So I understand that they did not get any support, they did not get any extra supplies to do that. activity. They probably just got a scream from Moscow to do something, and that's what they're doing. Because there is no real military reason in that activity. At least where they're attacking near Avdiivka, it is a very difficult problem for attacking side because of the geography, of the way we have our defense lines set up. They're wasting more and more people there. Those hundreds of people left to rot on the front there near Avdiivka, they probably have even less meaning than near Bakhmut. It's probably a more difficult spot for them to try. Well, Alexei, but they cannot do anything else, right? Exactly, Mark. They cannot do anything else. They're using the same old small pincer, big pincer movement. They don't have enough effort, enough supplies to do the big pincer, but they're still trying to use the small pincer. And throughout the whole war, they have not even invented anything new, anything unusual, which says a ton about the Russian School of Operative Command. And where did they waste all that experience, which they inherited from Soviet Army, which showed very interesting operations at the end of Second World War. The Manchuria, Wisla Order, Chisinau operations, they're very interesting, but these guys have not learned anything. They can barely function at a C- level. Now, that C-, of course, still works if you throw enough effort into that, otherwise we wouldn't have pincers around Bakhmut. But this is only achieved by throwing more and more dead bodies, and also when they have enough artillery advantage on the front and some aviation, then they can at least achieve some results. But again, war is not solved with one battle, and Bakhmut is cannot even called a battle of that kind, because Russia is screaming that Bakhmut is a symbol, and if they take it, morale of Ukrainians will fall. Well, our president came over and supported our troops there, so our morale is pretty high there. And frankly, very shortly, that situation near Bakhmut will be resolved. And again, I will not say the usual crown phrase, 2-3 weeks, you mean? Yeah, I will not say that exactly time frame, but very shortly it will be resolved one way or another. And then we'll see how counteroffensive unfolds, because the land will be dry by then. All right, we'll talk about the dry land right after. Do you think we need to keep the map or take it off? Yeah, let's take it off. We called the most active spots there. There are also some reports from the south, from Zaporozhye, that Ukrainian troops are venturing into small intel operations across the border, sensing Russian defense lines. So there is some activity happening there. But according to what's coming and the reports coming from that front, it seems like it's just tactical skirmishes there. There are no big strategic moves. We have about 282,000 watching us live. 84,000 of you clicked the like button. We've been live for about 17 minutes. Please do not forget to share links. And if you do that during the show again, as I said, it will get more eyeballs on YouTube. Do not forget to subscribe if you have not done that. Ukraine is preparing a great counteroffensive that will shock the world. Zaluzhny's troop, Dan Rice, so he's an advisor to Zaluzhny, and I haven't seen that. It went out of my radar, didn't know that. But he's saying that Ukrainian counteroffensive will shock the world. How do you gauge the statement? Because there are different estimations. I want you to comment on that. There are other statements. Secretary of State of the United States, Blinken, says that Ukraine may try to take some territories back, not militarily, by other means. I don't know what he means there. Stoltenberg talks about prolonged warfare. Mark Milley, the head of committee, the Joint Chiefs of Staff of the United States, is saying that Zelensky's plans about bringing Crimea to the fold of Ukraine are somewhat at the maximum of what Ukraine can achieve. So, anyway, speaking of that counteroffensive, I think it already creates a certain psychological pressure, like any expectation of that scale, either scary or pleasurable. It affects everybody who is awaiting for that eventuality to unfold, and it gives some fruit. And it gives us also basis to discuss that deeper. Do you think it is a part of psychological pressure from Ukraine and Ukraine allies to scare Moscow and their army? Because the analysis indeed shows that Ukrainian counteroffensive can be very successful. Mark, every war, first of all, is an information warfare. And then after that, it's everything else. Because in the pyramid of war, the highest chain in the food pyramid is information war. It is discussion who is against whom, who is in juxtaposition to whom, who is allies, who is with you, who is against you. Of course, psychological pressure that is being exerted on the enemy with these discussions, I think it is planned. And also some elements of that are ad hoc, but when the first persons of different committees come out, these are not accidental steps. And I agree that counteroffensive will happen. It will surprise everybody, and it will not conclude the war. Regardless of how successful it will be, how far do we go, sooner or later we'll run out of steam and we'll stop. And the question will be, what will be the front line at that time? How much land will we be able to take back? How much land will they be able to hold onto? And depending on that, I think situation will change drastically. Now the question will be how drastically it will change. First of all, political situation in our favor. For an example, as a result of this offensive, we might get to the border of Crimea and the northern shores of Azov Sea. And the enemy will have what they had by the beginning of 24th of February last year, parts of Lugansk region and Crimea. Just by itself, that's a big effort, right? If we liberate all or almost all territories that Russian troops have annexed initially. So aggressor has lost already. Now, then holding these regions that they might still be holding at that time will be an interesting proposition, because we can shell with our artillery throughout that area, because it's not too wide of Lugansk and Donetsk areas. They're pretty narrow, and Crimea is also pretty close. Even if we run out of steam with tanks and infantry, we can definitely hit their ships with harpoons, we can hit their ammo dumps with artillery and HIMARS. So you can imagine how much it'll cost them to hold these areas. And I think even the last Putin supporter in Russia will see that they're losing that whole adventure. And then Russia will have a political crisis. It will not be, I think, a people's crisis. I think it'll be a political crisis of the elites. If the economy fails, then it might become a people's crisis. Now, I heard the information that in Russia they're trying to allow private entrepreneurs to dig for gold. That's rare. They usually the government reserves all that for themselves, but allowing people to dig for gold, basically letting them to support themselves financially one way or another. So we're seeing other economic bells and rings that they have big issues. They still might hold some part of Ukraine, and to liberate that we might need more armament, more training, and then we might need a second wave of that counteroffensive. How long it'll take? We're seeing that this one is taking roughly about half a year. If we consider that we started somewhere around November, and at least we'll go into April or May, right? So half a year. So maybe that. It might take another half a year, the second phase of that. But it will be first a very different war from when it started, because we'll destroy them and push them further out to the south and to the east. It will not be even us waiting for enemy to attack us and to bite us on one side or another. It'll be the war dedicated to finishing our enemy. Russia is still going to suffer with sanctions. They'll not be able to throw anything new on the front. They will, at best, be able to hold a small piece of land by throwing tens of thousands of their mobilized troops without any preparation, and will be mixing all that with dirt. Before tanks and infantry proceeds, will work with aviation and HIMARS. Will the war be over at that point? No. Will everybody understand where it goes to? Yes. Are the moods going to change radically? And political situation in Russia will likely change drastically as well. So, for us it will be much better, I think. For them it will be much worse, but I think it'll be the war to finish the loser. The question is how much Russia wants to have it, and how much Russian people want to have it. I don't think they're being asked, Alexei. I understand, but they may answer before being asked. Right now, they still have some illusions that they might hold on to the captured territories and annex them and append them to Russia, or leave them as those quasi-republics. But from what we hear from the Chinese leader, they have not refused from supporting the principle of territorial integrity of Ukraine in this case. And supporting these territories is eating Russian resources a ton, military resources, financial resources, other supplies. There's basically no diplomatic support for Russia as well. They have no allies if you don't count Syria. And situation when they're saying that, okay, we wasted 150,000 people, but we got the territories, that's one thing. When they're saying that, oh, we lost all these people and more, but we are still back at the February border, what for? What are we doing there? Remember that Ouroboros, that is biting its tail, they ran throughout the whole circle. They destroyed their military, destroyed their economy, destroyed a lot of their opportunities to develop in the future, and losing markets, losing Europe. And they lost a ton, they lost a lot of acquisitions by Russian Empire since probably Peter the Great. That's the result. And destruction will be great. The war will continue as long as that aging Baldy stays in power in Russia, but that's probably linked to his survival. And they have military losses, but they have a huge territory where they can still scramble more resources and throw people to the front, but it'll be a much less effective. And after 3 or 4 months of intensive fighting, they still need rest and respite. So for me, the perspectives of Kremlin are very gloom, very grim. They're still not believing in their death. We'll see how it unfolds. Right, exactly. All right. So after Xi Jinping's visit to Moscow, the landscape in the United States is changing. We understand Trump and DeSantis are changing their rhetoric. The main candidates on the conservative front who were actually making different statements about the war, and suddenly DeSantis comes out and says that Putin is a war criminal and he needs to be made accountable for his crimes. And that is unfolding because China started to appear in the frame. If China is now in the picture and is doing some sort of agreements with Moscow, or turning it into a vassal territory of its own, or dependent territory on China, DeSantis before called the war in Ukraine not a priority for United States, but since China is involved, it is a red flag for Trump and DeSantis, so both of them are now changing their stance. Piantkovsky sent me a message here with the links to Western media that he's following closely. He's saying that DeSantis changed his point of view on that conflict, and basically the quotes listed are saying that, oh, if China is supportive or somewhat trying to support Russia, then we should be supporting Ukraine. So Xi Jinping's visit produced a different effect on Republicans in America than expected. And some people were saying that Trump was holding his position because of his initial stance on that whole Russia thing. And now this stance is changing because of China's involvement, because China was definitely part of their focal attention points. This is exactly what we're talking about, Mark. Just ideological conversation between Russia and China, and possibility of maybe Russia becoming closer to Chinese sphere of influence. It leaves no chances for Ukraine to stay neutral. Because imagine there is a Western bloc, NATO countries with European Union, and then there is China and Russia, and what's in the middle? Neutral Ukraine? The land that will be continuously fought over. So, of course, Ukraine will not stay in that position for long. Who will leave it for Russia or China to try to take it again, attempt it again? So, nobody. It may take us years to join NATO and EU proper, but again, there is an iron curtain shutting down along the borders of Ukraine and Russia. Europe is already recognizing that. And Ukraine could only stay neutral when there was no relations, no warming up between Russia and China, and the West wanted to balance China by trade with them and all. That's why Merkel and the others also voted against NATO expanding to Ukraine in 2010 in Bucharest. Now these conditions changed. The only road for us is to join NATO and European Union. We're the most effective factor in holding off Russia. We wasted their military, we physically disabled it, and we have about 1 million people under arms, and our army is victorious. So this is a great force that Europe might have. And it does need effective control. The West understands that they cannot just drop any control of this group. And the only control that can be exerted is by, for example, taking Ukraine into NATO. And I'm actually thankful to Xi Jinping for that visit to Moscow, because this is not only changing the rhetoric of Republicans, which America still has some isolationist rhetoric there in that wing, that America first. Here people start to realize that it's a big geopolitical strategic game in the scale of the whole planet, new unions and new actions. And when there is such a resistance, each soldier needs to be assigned to a side. If we're talking about Uganda and Zimbabwe, they're pretty far, but even there, Chinese influence is already struggling with French and American. But Europe, when the hot war is an active phase, and the war is not of just somebody, but of some pro-Western Ukraine with pro-Chinese Russia, here I think we're in a good position. I think God still loves us and is organizing the events and the visits by Xi Jinping in a way that it affects the West. If you take the Grandpa Brzezinski, if he was alive, he said a lot of things even before his death. But it is obvious. He did mention it's obvious where the border should lie. And even Kissinger is already acknowledging that in the light of facing China. If there was no union between, or attempt to warm up between Russia and China, things might be unfolding differently. Now everything will unfold much faster in the historical time frame, just because of that warming up between Russia and China, and because the formation of that perceived bloc between them. And we are paying a huge price for staying on that side of the Iron Curtain, and we're not going to be on the eastern side of it. All right, we have 327,000, over 110,000 if you click the like button. Continue asking those who are watching us, please click that like icon right now, and if you can, share information about these streams in your social media with friends, with those who discuss these matters of Ukraine. We're trying to stick with the same schedule. Sometimes we travel and have to skip a day, but, don't judge us too harshly. Anyway, to proceed, President of Finland signed a decree of joining this country into NATO, and seems like Turkey has no questions to Finland. Erdogan made a statement that Finland is duly fulfilling all the responsibilities of joining NATO, and Turkish parliament is supportive. No commentary on Sweden, but the next summit they probably can push it through. How do you see that situation? If Finland will be taken on that summit in July in Vilnius, even if without Sweden, do you think it changes situation, and contextually how it will affect the war in Ukraine? Because Finland is actively looking for ways to support Ukraine, even with jets. So Sweden technically is in different military unions, regardless of not being part of NATO. And by the way, half a year ago, America already made a statement that Sweden will be defended the same way that any other European country. As for taking Sweden or commenting on Sweden joining NATO, Turkey will likely not comment on that until elections. But after elections, after they happen, Turkey will probably understand, and he might actually expedite and change his position to allow Sweden to expedite joining into NATO. We understand that he is using that anti-Turkey, anti-Quran rhetoric by the minority in Sweden as his election campaign card. So when this is over, things might change. And if, in general, Turkey is a difficult country where they do have some resistance between religious village areas and more secular towns and cities. So Erdogan needs to play his card smart, and he'll probably not comment much on Sweden or change his rhetoric on that until the elections. After that, situation might change drastically. And Americans are still working with Sweden. And by the way, just joining of Finland joining NATO is already a big blow to Russia. Even if Finland joins NATO first, maybe half a year later Sweden will join, maybe with a little lag, but in the grand scheme of things it doesn't change. They're on that vector, and they're already participating in the operations in Baltic Sea, in training, in mutual support. They were always integrated in these defense forces. There'll be formal joining NATO maybe half a year later or a year later for Sweden, if we take the more fringe scenario. But I think it'll unfold rather successful for that country. All right, we've been over 38 minutes live. We have a little bit of time left. A couple topics continued to delight us. One of them is Kirby commenting on Russian pilots being awarded medals for shooting down American UAV. And they didn't even shoot it down. They basically were spraying it with fuel and trying to maneuver it down out of the sky. Kirby said they're idiots because the dangerous maneuvers could lead to crashing two machines together, as a result of which Russian jet might have fallen out of the sky and sunk and could have been casualties. So he doesn't see any heroic action in sprinkling UAVs and jet fuel. Russia got pissed after these statements. They basically, summing up their reaction, they were telling him, "You're a fool yourself." But as a result, they did award their guy and trumped him up as the hero, national hero, the pilot. And to me, I'm puzzled. What is the great action that he had done? But yeah, Putin's regime made some public event out of this. And adjacent to that, I want you to comment on this. Our favorite shorty, Medvedev, he doesn't let us get bored. He was reading Stalin's telegram on the meeting dedicated to governmental order from their military-industrial complex. You even saw he was wearing a leather vest, pretending to be one of the people's commissars. There was a figure called Vannikov during the Second World War who was a Jew. He was taken out of prison to try to recover some of the industries. He did quite a bit to prop Soviet Union up in the industrial area, but in Stalin's manner, do that or you'll get executed. I lived in Kuibyshev and Voronezh aviation plant that was producing Il jets was built in that fashion. You got to build it or you die. And so this shorty comes out and says, after Xi Jinping's visit, and says, makes a statement that the threat of nuclear war did not decrease, it actually increased. So my impression, he's run away from a psychiatric ward, and I'm trying to put some logic in here. Why is he out shaking his lower appendage, that clown from a Chapiteau circus? Mark, people who manage to put icons and pictures of Stalin and Nikolai together when one aided in death of killing the other one, not directly, but as a result of his actions. And people who wear military insignia together with Gagarin on their t-shirts, these people do not understand that this mix of eclectics, on one side there would be a t-shirt with Gagarin, on the other side there would be that guy with a sledgehammer killing somebody. These people don't understand one thing, that Russian top is so demoralized